So maybe we can kick things off with a general framework, right? You're already familiar with applied conversational hypnosis, the techniques, the steps, the loops we can run within them, the purposes, the gift, the hero fuel, the identity, the values, all that sort of stuff. You're familiar with those general concepts, right? So I'd like to go a little bit higher, more of a strategy level, and to do that, it helps, in my mind at least, to turn a little bit more metaphoric so that we don't get bogged down by technique. Because remember, we're looking at principles here, right? So what is it that we're trying to achieve with applied conversational hypnosis? Remember, this is a general paradigm for influence, right? The applied conversational hypnosis is the context into which the hypnotherapy fits to make the hypnotherapy easier. It's also the context in which your consultation fits, like your sales conversations, your influence conversations, so that the things that you're talking about have a deeper impact on people, right? So it's really, and people have called hypnosis an amplifier of experience, and I think that's the way to look at it. Hypnosis is not a thing of itself, it's something that amplifies other things that we do, right? So what's our role then in the world as conversational hypnotists? We've talked about being a force for good, and I think we're all on the same page on that one, right? And there's a certain place for us to maybe step up and take kind of a leadership role in communities and things like that, right? And I wouldn't want you to take away from that at all. But once we are in a position where we're actually applying it on a one-to-one sort of basis, right? I think there's a fundamental attitude switch that happens. Leadership is still part of it, but what style of leadership? The metaphor I have in my mind, and this one I think fits specifically well with applied conversational hypnosis, which is more the passive style that we've been exploring, as opposed to the active style, which is the old power of conversational hypnosis approach. And you can see how the two, by the way, dovetail nicely. I'm not saying that the older approach is defunct. It's a very practical and useful approach. Just when you blend it together with this approach, you now have a much more powerful vehicle. You get the idea? So the metaphor I have for this particular vehicle is, in fact, the round table is actually, ironically, a very good description for this, because it's the relationship between Arthur and Merlin. You're all familiar with the Arthurian cycle, right? Our role as hypnotists is not to be Arthur, but to be Merlin. Now, you can, of course, be Arthur in your own life. If you're running your own company, if you're doing something other than, say, hypnotherapy or coaching, then or even if you're doing hypnotherapy or coaching, whilst you are the professional, you're being an Arthur, you're building things, you are inviting to things, you're bringing people into your little private Camelot, that sort of stuff, right? But as soon as you apply these principles to empower someone else, to help someone else, to be a force for good in their lives, we need to make a fundamental switch to the Merlin role, right? We're no longer the ones who are center stage, they need to be. And this is, I think, a fundamental attitude switch from more classical hypnosis, where the hypnotist was center stage and the subject has kind of followed along with it. And there's nothing wrong with that approach, by the way. It works when it works. And when it doesn't work, other things are needed, right? So I'm not trying to say that you can't do hypnosis in any other way. What I'm trying to suggest is that applied conversational hypnosis is optimized for the Merlin role rather than the Arthur role, because we're trying to make the person that we are talking to into a hero, right? You've all seen the power of identities, right? And by giving someone an aspirational identity, it can be a complete game changer. Behaviors change, attitudes change, perceptual filters change, the way they converse change, the way they think change, the way they feel change, all in order to align with a particular identity that is both empowering and inspiring to them. You get the idea? So if we look at people in general, and we create a simple dichotomy, in other words, we create global identities, and we try and fit people into one or other of these categories in a simple way. Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to do some profiling tool where we shoehorn people into a particular role. This is just a simple filtering mechanism to find out where is the person I'm talking to at, so that I know which direction to take them in, right? So overall, when you talk to people, they'll be playing one of two roles, the hero or the victim, or the villain actually, right? I'll put victim and villain in the same sort of thing, right? They're the person who succeeds, achieves stuff, is a force for good in the world, or they're failures, they're losers, they mess things up. And when I say these terms, by the way, I'm not trying to label them. I'm not trying to say, any particular person's a loser and so on. I'm talking about more about how they perceive themselves and how they therefore act and respond to the world. Does that make sense? A victim, someone with a victim mentality, someone who identifies with being a victim, fundamentally reacts to the world differently to someone who perceives themselves as a hero. Does that make sense? Someone who perceives themselves as a villain, a loser, or anything like that will fundamentally talk different, think different, feel different, act differently from someone who perceives themselves to be more of a hero role as well, right? And by hero, I'm not talking about the narcissistic version of the hero that everyone sits there and praises. I'm talking about the person who does the right thing for the right reason, regardless of the consequences. That's the key element here. Has anyone, you guys familiar with military awards like the Purple Cross, the Purple Heart and the Victoria Cross in England, right? Each country has their own version of this. So you have all kinds of different medals, but there's a couple of, each country, each culture has one particular badge of honor that is exceptional, above everything else, right? And if you look at the research on people who have received these awards, the Purple Heart in the US, the Victoria Cross in England, I'm not quite sure what other cultures use. The people who receive this have a very interesting profile. We call them heroes, but usually these are very much more unassuming people who don't really feel like heroes. They were just stuck in a really bad situation, and they did something selfless because they needed it. So typically, maybe a platoon or something is pinned down under gunfire, and one man gets up and basically does something crazy to pull everyone out of that situation, right? He's not doing it for himself. He's doing it because no one else is stepping up. And if no one steps up, then everyone's gone. Does that kind of make sense to you guys? So this is the kind of hero I mean, not the kind that's going out to say, you can congratulate me now. You don't have to put your underwear on the outside of your trousers, right? You don't have to look good in spandex. The kind of hero I'm talking about is someone who does the right thing at the right time, regardless of the consequences, because it needs to happen, right? So helping people to become heroes, I think, is a pretty good thing, right? That's really that's where Merlin's really the big hero, because would Arthur and the dream of Camelot and the idea of the rule of law, which really was Camelot, was the seed idea, was coming through that, right? At a time when feudal England was constantly at war, and you had more robber barons than you had, people looking after their people. It was a really powerful idea to fix a lot of the injustices in the world at the time, right? So it's a powerful role. Could that have happened without Merlin? No, he's the catalyst. He's the one who found Arthur, set up the whole mythology of the sword and the stone, trained Arthur, prepared him for his role, made sure he steered him in the right directions, and importantly, at the right time, the one who left, who bowed out, so that who does the world remember? Arthur or Merlin? Right? Do you see where we're going with this idea so far? Now, this idea of switching our perspective from the Arthur to the Merlin, right? You can be the Arthur of your own life, but you're always the Merlin of someone else's. You get the idea? Right? At least in the capacity of a coach or a hypnotherapist or even a salesperson, your job really is to help the other person to be empowered, to be the force for good, to be the winner, to make the right choice, etc. Right? So this attitude of being kind of more of a Merlin figure, it feeds into how we approach the work, right? And I like the concept of Merlin because he's the guy who, I don't know if you know the legend of Merlin, but he was said to have been born backwards. In other words, he was born remembering his future, right? So he knew everything was coming anyways. And so he could set Arthur up in one way, and then 6 months down the line, well, he just remembered what was going to happen. You get the idea. This is the kind of a twisted part of the tale. And that's part of the role that people look to you as well. Even if you actually don't know the future, if they have a sense that you know where this is going and it's benign, then people tend to get excited and go, all right, I trust you, I'll go with this. And then you have the chance of creating what's called a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Provided someone stays in a particular, on the playing field long enough, so even if they're just tiptoeing around the edges of it, eventually, if inspired enough and nudged enough, they'll start taking more and more action in the right direction, and they'll do the learning they need to be able to achieve what they want, right?